Right. Our reading this morning comes from the late Forrest Church's book, The Separation of Church and State, Writings on a Fundamental Freedom by America's Founders. On both the religious right and secular left, much contemporary confusion stems from an inability to distinguish between the universal spiritual values that underlie the American experiment in democracy and the role assigned to government to advance those same values by protecting freedom of conscience and belief. The American Revolution was not driven by the anti-religious pathos that powered the French Revolution a decade later. In the Declaration of Independence, our most secular founder emphatically proclaims, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights." Citing as his authority nature and nature's God, he establishes for liberty and equality a clear metaphysic. The founders' professed goal was to establish a nation true to the spirit of divine law, a spirit some understood in Christian terms and others according to the canons of Enlightenment philosophy. These two streams met to affirm the dual imperatives of equality and liberty, best expressed in the motto, E pluribus unum. And the first liberty the founders endeavored to ensure, articulating in the First Amendment what already was enshrined in their hearts, was religious liberty. Sworn on the altar of God, as one founder put it, to protect freedom of conscience, they established a clear line of demarcation between church and state, not to abridge, but to fulfill the nation's spiritual mandate.
Last year, on the morning after July 4th, I drove to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to participate in the 2023 National Convention of Braver Angels, a bipartisan organization working to bridge the political divides between blue and red America. I was one of those blue delegates selected to participate in drafting a Rise for America platform only 1 year ahead of a contentious presidential election. Braver Angels wanted to have a balanced number of Democratic and Republican-leaning voters there, as well as a representative sampling of independents. A quick scan of the crowd showed how well they had succeeded in that. The independent delegates wore their name tags on yellow lanyards. The Republicans wore theirs on red. The Democrats wore theirs on blue. For the 3 days we would be meeting together, we were instructed to mix and mingle. On the college campus where we gathered, we were assigned to mixed rooming groups. We were assigned to workshops enrolling mixed participants. We were told to sit at mixed tables in the dining hall, and we did. So when I found myself having a meal with a handful of delegates wearing white lanyards, I was confused. They told me they all, for institutional reasons, were required to maintain a neutral identity and had to exempt themselves from any partisan identification. Mostly they were employed in governmental, education, or religious organizations. I immediately envied them their exempted status. It had never occurred to me to request this for myself, despite having been a religious professional for decades. How had I overlooked the separation of church and state that Americans have enshrined in law? It is very clearly established in the First Amendment of the United States Bill of Rights, which states that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Even before it was ratified in 1791, though, the First Amendment was the subject of impassioned debate. Impassioned debate about it still continues centuries later. In his 2004 collection, The Separation of Church and State, the late Forrest Church, a mentor of mine in Unitarian Universalist ministry, wrote that how citizens today view the founders' intent is as much a Rorschach test of our personal religious and civic views as it is a true picture. 20 years ago, he asked readers, does church-state discriminate against religion, or to the contrary, is organized religion increasingly trespassing on secular ground? Reverend Church observed that issues such as these divide the American people right down the middle. And in the two decades since his book was published, the divide he describes seems, sadly, to have widened significantly. For those of you counting, Election Day is now only 9 days away, and by all indications, the 2024 presidential contest is too close for anyone to predict its outcome. We are very far from anything resembling a national consensus about the Democratic or the Republican candidate, much to the consternation of so many people active in each of their campaigns. There are more than 160 million registered voters in the U.S. today, and poll after poll shows them almost evenly divided. Regardless of whomever is elected, our next president will be tasked with governing a deeply divided country with approximately 80 million unhappy voters. It seems like a sorry state of affairs, doesn't it? Throughout our weekend in Gettysburg last July, Braver Angels arranged for convention delegates to take tours of the surrounding Civil War battlefields, including the spot where President Abraham Lincoln gave his famous address in 1863, voicing a hope and a shared determination that in the aftermath of such bitter conflict, this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Like many of you, I was taught to memorize this great passage from American history as a school child, so these lines remain stirringly familiar to me. Even as I read them aloud to you this morning, I hear how much they sound like a prayer. Lincoln's prayer is one I am inclined to repeat with greater and greater fervor these days. Perhaps you might be inclined to repeat it too. Let me state the obvious. Democracy is a difficult undertaking. It asks an awful lot of us. This cannot be lost to anyone in a sanctuary today. Democracy is very difficult, and there have been eras in our history when it has seemed impossibly so. We may, however reluctantly, however regretfully, be living in the midst of one of those eras ourselves. Our liberal religious tradition has long upheld the right of conscience and the use of democratic process as a guiding principle of ours, because we understand that democracy is a spiritual discipline that requires our sincere and collective commitment if it is, in fact, to succeed. On both the religious right and the secular left, Reverend Church wrote in his book, much contemporary confusion stems from an inability to distinguish between the universal spiritual values that underlie the American experiment in democracy and the role assigned to government to advance those same values by protecting freedom of conscience and belief. I personally worry that not enough Americans on either the right or the left truly appreciate those universal spiritual values underlying this massive democratic experiment we are presently running. It is fundamentally a moral project, this attempt to collectivize conscience, however imperfectly we might do that. Instead of asking who is right, we are supposed to ask what is right and answer that with our best understanding moment to moment. By guaranteeing every individual's freedom of conscience, by each of us voting in accordance with our own beliefs and values, we work to approximate the highest and the greatest good. A classmate of mine from seminary, Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia, is fond of saying that a vote is a kind of prayer for the world we desire for ourselves and for our children, and I think our prayers are strongest when we pray together. I suspect that most of you here today are inclined to agree with that sentiment. Like several of you, I have worked hard to get out the vote this election cycle. For the past couple of months, I have staffed a Monday night phone bank that works to recruit poll observers in a crucial swing state. I have written scores of postcards to voters in the Deep South, which is a number I now know is dwarfed by the hundreds upon hundreds that members of this church have mailed out. So as you may have guessed from that blue lanyard I mentioned at the outset, I am a lifelong Democrat. In our admittedly flawed two-party system, I have stayed fairly consistent. I mostly believe in my party platform and generally support Democratic candidates for office. But I also mix and mingle with Republicans. I even married one. And occasionally, I vote for them too. This hotly contested presidential election is commonly depicted as an intense competition between blue states and red states with winners take all, and only a few swing states, they usually appear as yellow in media maps, poised to decide this race in the last. More often than I care to admit, I hear accounts of people from blue states refusing to even travel to red states these days, and vice versa. Braver Angels has suggested that we find ourselves in the middle of a cold civil war, What is quickly disappearing from our national landscape over the course of it are purplish spaces, and also several shades of gray around pressing issues in the life of our country. In a recent opinion piece for the New York Times, editorial writer David Brooks cautioned that rancorous partisanship in American politics was taking on the emotional charge of a holy war. In days gone by, parties were political organizations designed to win elections and gain power. Party leaders would expand their coalitions toward that end, he wrote in mid-October. Today, on the other hand, in an increasingly secular age, political parties are better seen as religious organizations that exist to provide believers with meaning, membership, and moral sanctification, he observed. If that's your purpose, of course you have to stick to the existing gospel. You have to focus your attention on affirming the creed of current true believers, Brooks concluded. You get so buried within the walls of your own catechism, you can't even imagine what it would be like to think outside it. Brooks notes that as our two major political parties become more like quasi-religions, unquote, the real power lies with what he calls its priesthood, the dispersed array of media figures, podcast hosts, and activists who run the convention, define party orthodoxy, and determine the boundaries of acceptable belief. The heterodox, and yes, the heretical, are silenced as those boundaries of belief become fresh battle lines. As a student of religious history, I understand that holy wars never end well. They function much like civil wars in that the costs of the conflict are devastating. When I think about the separation of church and state in our contemporary context, I think it serves to warn us against mistaking our political allegiances for religious commitments. Universalists in America once claimed the words of poet Edwin Markham as a kind of sacred scripture. You may recognize, even now, lines from his 1899 poem, Outwitted, a brief but powerful verse. They drew a circle that shut me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took them in. Our musical meditation this morning encouraged each of us to draw the circle wide. Draw the circle wide, draw it wider still. Do we dare to remain faithful to our heretical heritage and humanize our political opponents, even if they refuse to humanize us? Can we today attempt to outwit the pernicious dynamics of division? In his book, Reverend Church was encouraging us to keep our personal, religious, and civic views distinct to the fullest extent possible. He wrote this as the son of a United States senator, a man he called his political hero. Remember, your spiritual worldview is not on the ballot this November or any other November either. Our deepest commitments and our dearest values, those are not things that we as people of faith would ever dream of putting up to a vote. Whatever happens in the 2024 election, your freedom to believe as you do remains. Whether or not your candidate wins, your soul is yours alone to lose. Keep that in mind this November 5th. In his book, Reverend Church contends that the same metaphysic that undergirds the Declaration of Independence, that among these truths Americans hold to be self-evident, is a conviction that in addition to all of us being created equal, we are each endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. This undergirds the United States Constitution and its Bill of Rights, too. The founders' professed goal was to establish a nation true to the spirit of divine law. These two streams met to affirm the dual imperative of equality and liberty, best expressed in the motto E pluribus unum, he wrote, sworn on the altar of God, as one put it, to protect freedom of conscience. They established a clear line of demarcation between church and state, not to abridge, but to fulfill this nation's spiritual mandate. When our very first president took his inaugural oath, he spontaneously added the phrase, "So help me God," to the solemn oath he swore. And every president since then has added that language simply as a matter of custom. I think it speaks rather powerfully to the exercise of spiritual humility that is required in the practice of democracy, and also expresses reverence for the sacred dimension of our civic life. The greatest privilege and the chief duty we have as Americans is to inhabit a nation that seeks to stay true to the spirit of divine law, that affirms the dual imperatives of equality and liberty, and protects individuals' freedom of conscience in a precise fulfillment of our spiritual mandate. I believe this with all my heart and my mind and my soul and my strength. And yet, an article of faith that complete would never fit on a bumper sticker or on a lawn sign or on a campaign button. Every Monday night, as soon as we're done with our phone banking, we volunteers get a text thanking us for participating once more in a voter protection action and asking us to reply with a message explaining why each of us took action that particular evening. Because I'm usually pretty tired by that point, I reply with the same curt response week after week. Dignity, I type. Decency, I type. Democracy. Those three words, the 3 Ds, provide a summary capsule of my deepest commitments, and they always end in democracy. My friends with teenagers and 20-somethings tell me that their voting age kids have said that they do not believe in democracy any longer. Fine, I say, although honestly I doubt it is. Then tell me what form of self-governance they prefer. I have yet to get a satisfactory answer. I understand younger voters' gravest reservations. They see a democracy badly damaged by toxic polarization, menaced by autocratic impulses, and downgraded in international rankings. These are dynamics we all discussed yesterday afternoon in the depolarizing workshop held here as part of Peace Week, Delaware. So we have some serious work to do now. All of us, whether we identify as Democrat or Republican or Independent, we have serious work to do as Americans who are committed to putting our country above any political party. While we have yet to hit the mark set by E pluribus unum, the Latin motto which translates out of many, one, we can aim to strike that balance between plurality and unity, between them and me and you and us. In my front yard sits a lawn sign I ordered from Braver Angels in January 2021, shortly after an angry mob stormed the U.S. Capitol building. It reads, "Hold America Together," and has the American flag shaped as a heart, bright red, white, and blue. I had planned to leave it out through the first 100 days of the incoming presidential administration, but then I never took it in. It may well stay there for another 4 years. Who knows? What I know for certain is that we desperately need, the white between the red and the blue now more than ever. We have to stop confusing partisanship with patriotism because it is not that. Political extremism makes a truly terrible religion. We need to take care that we don't make an idol out of an election cycle or a graven image out of the White House. We, the people, are charged with the sacred duty of making sure that the United States shall yet have a new birth of freedom, as President Lincoln said in 1863, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Let that be our common prayer this November. One of the many gifts of having Reverend Church as my mentor in ministry was that he was always giving me copies of his latest book, and he had so many books. And each one was a signed edition at that. Most volumes he signed over to me with love, Forrest. His book on that fundamental freedom guaranteed by the separation of church and state, however, is signed simply with hope. With hope. However we can, we ought to try lending one another hope in the coming months. They are likely to prove challenging. Democracy is predicated on differences of opinions, and it matters tremendously how we navigate our national disagreements. That's what makes a horse race, we might say, or that's what makes a competitive election. Of course, voting feels much different if we believe we are choosing between opposing goods instead of the lesser of two evils. But we are here today in the situation we find ourselves. Let's be here with open hearts and minds. Absolutely, vote your conscience on Election Day and urge your family and friends to do the same, to vote their conscience on Election Day. Alongside your highest hope for this country, though, hold an abundant love for its people. Whatever their shade or stripe, we Americans are most readily recognizable when we stick together.
Thank you, Reverend Kelly. Before the stewardship comments, a couple of quick announcements about some very important things. Representing the Minister Search Committee, I present to you that we have conducted to this point 8 cottage meetings, both live and Zoom. There are 3 remaining. 2 of them are right after the service. One is in room 25, that's open to any member of the church or friend. And there's another one beginning at 12:30. The one in room 25 starts at noon. This is a discussion of what preferences we have in seeking a new minister. The one at 12:30 is aimed for youth and youth parents, and that will take place in the youth lounge. And our 11th and final cottage meeting will be out at Kendall Crosslands tomorrow afternoon from 2 to 3. If you have not yet submitted your online survey, which whether or not you've attended a cottage meeting, we encourage you to do by the deadline, which is Thursday, October 31st. Today's offering, a little different, but still familiar, will be a dedicated offering, a share the plate offering, as we call it, for UUA Disaster Relief Fund, which has been hit hard, as has the need. It's reported that this fund is at its lowest level of available funds since the project of disaster relief began in 2017, with Hurricane Milton and all of its descendants doing so much damage in Florida and other states. The need continues and continues to grow. So when the ushers wait upon you today, which is not yet, they will be receiving an offering that will go in its entirety to the UUA Disaster Relief Fund. Now this. My mother handed me a pint-sized jar with a little slot in the top and said, "Put your leftover change in this and save it. When you buy something with a dollar bill, put the coins you get back in the jar." Well, this sage advice was presented to an 8-year-old me when I was whining that I wanted a new bicycle. But I had no idea how to save for one, so I was reaching to a higher power. I did receive a modest allowance from my parents in exchange for really token labors around the house, successfully completing assigned chores. And though never really an entrepreneur on the Myers-Briggs scale, I had a small lawn mowing operation in the neighborhood, which accrued $2 per lawn per week. I also shoveled the neighbors' walks in the winter. But while my income may have seemed to be swelling, I also had expenses. I mean, after all, a guy needs a ginger ale and chips, as well as an occasional candy bar to reward his hard labor. So I started funneling the leftover coins from such purchases as my mother had guided me into the savings jar. And I swore to myself not to touch that source of bounty for any other reason than the purchase of a new bike. After many months, to my hopeful satisfaction, the jar was filling up, even though it pained me to put all those coins in there after just buying a nickel candy bar with a dollar bill. By the next spring, there was a bike sale at Montgomery Ward's, and I didn't want to miss it. This was my chance. I also knew there wasn't enough cash in my jar yet, but timing was of the essence. The sale would not last long, so I went to Mom and Dad to explain my dilemma, and I'll spare you that verbatim, but my parents agreed to cover the rest of the bicycle expense as a boost to make my dream come true. A few years later, that huffy bicycle enabled me to have a newspaper route, which was the next step in my entrepreneurial experimentation. The moral of this story for First U: we're not campaigning for bicycles. In the context of our budget, we had many streams of offering to benefit our mission. Your gifts and my gifts, your mission and my mission, though none of ours is sufficient alone. First U needs each of us, sometimes reaching beyond what we think we have to give and do a boost in order to complete the dream. We have many dreams. When they begin to take shape and present themselves as clear objectives, may we all consider our hearts about the boost. Now, would you please join me in dedicating our offering? To the work of this congregation, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives and these our offerings. The ushers will now wait upon you for your gifts of the day. If you have a candle, a chalice with a candle at home, we invite you at this time to prepare to extinguish it as we do so here in the sanctuary. As our flame is extinguished for now, let us be a beacon of freedom held out to light the way. Let each of us be a light of reason illuminating the path. Let each of us be a spark of courage igniting our spirits. Let each of us leave this place aglow with hope.
May the quality of each of our lives be our benediction and a blessing to all we touch. Those who take hold of life, may you find life returning your embrace. Those who sense God, may you feel God always with you. Those who seek the right path, may the way appear ahead. Step out in faith and go in peace. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, the poet tells us. If only we're brave enough to be it. So be brave, friends, take heart, and keep calling one another to courage. Amen and blessed be.
Our closing hymn is number 1074. Please rise and sing as you wing.
Go